Sean Jaques, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be here, man. To suit up. I like it. Very nice.
Thank you. Well, getting started, would you mind sharing just a brief biographical sketch with the audience?
Well, I'm a man of many personalities, but I'll start
Good
with
thing
what
for
I'm
a writer.
currently doing. I live in a on the outskirts of Los Angeles right now, near Pasadena, foothill of these mountains. I write, of course, but I also teach. I'm a high school teacher of
Oh,
literature
cool.
and AP Lang at Burbank High School. You might have heard of Burbank.
Yes.
And currently, I'm off on summer break. That's why I'm so
Congratulations.
smiley. I like having my time off. And I have a lovely wife, and I got two little girls, one 12 and one 8. And that's what I'm doing right now. So I'll start there. But I've got a lot of other things in my past. This is who I am right now. Yeah.
So I'm curious, we'll just launch right into this. What is the essential book that you think every kid in school should read as a part
Ooh,
of literature? Like, what is that? This is the quintessential. If nothing else is read this year, you should read this book.
Frankenstein for high school
Oh,
students. Frankenstein. Yeah.
that's actually a really good poll. I had dinner with my fiance and her in-law and her brother-in-law and sister, and
Mhm.
he brought up Frankenstein. Was like, "Have you read this book? It's like transformational." Do you know that she was like 19 when she wrote it? And I'm like, very different times, but yes, like just
Yeah, the whole her story, Percy Shelley's story, the guy she ran off with, who died, her time with Lord Byron, the how this thing was written, and the story itself, its romanticism, the language is beautiful, the story is interesting. It's short, it's very
Mhm.
short. It's a great story to sort of introduced to mid to late teenagers about Frankenstein's not that big dude that's green with bolts between his neck. You should go read the book. So that's what I do. Yeah, I go with that. I will give another book though. It was the first book I ever read when I was in my late teens that I really enjoyed, and it made me think. I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. Is Brave New World by Huxley.
Oh, mhm.
Yeah. It's funny, it's crazy, it's science, it's religion, it's the whole bit. So I love teaching that book. So,
That's awesome. I
yeah,
still have yet to read Brave New World. I think it needs to get added into my book list.
you definitely need to read it. You absolutely, everybody should read this. Everybody should read this. Yeah.
So,
So,
talking about books that everyone should read, Doe Run, your debut novel, has
yeah.
hit shelves. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming, but I appreciate that. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Would you mind just sharing a brief synopsis about the book with the audience?
Sure. I guess the best way to sort of start out explaining it, the title, Doe Run is actually it's a fictitious town.
Hmm.
It's a small town in rural Missouri, in the Ozarks. The Ozarks is this comprised region that is in southern Missouri and sort of northern Arkansas. It dips a little bit into Oklahoma,
Hmm.
um, but that's where I grew up. But the story, the setting takes place in a town called Doe Run of about 2,000 people. It is 3 days before the start of deer hunting season. Deer hunting season in Missouri, hunting changes, but for a long time, it was like the 4th of July and
Hmm.
Christmas all at the same time. Everybody's gearing up, they're
Hmm.
scouting, they're buying their new gear, they're all hitting the woods. It's a very big excitement. So that's the setting. Now, the plot has to deal, the protagonist is a guy named Penn. Uh, Penn is his mid, early to mid 30s. He grew up in this town, but he left 13 years ago. He hated the town and he left under really bad circumstances.
Hmm.
Well, The story starts out, he returns to town after 13 years, 3 days before deer hunting season. And the only reason he is coming back to town is because he's on the lam, he's sort of desperate, and he has
Mhm.
found out that his very abusive father has died. So he's came back to
Great
gain
rejoicing.
whatever inheritance might be left from this dirtbag father he had. Well, he gets back to town and he finds out that his dirtbag dead father had squandered everything. There is nothing. So now here he is. He's still desperate. And so he sticks around in town and he finds out some information about some people he knew growing up. He found out that his very first love, his high school flame, his Romeo and
Mhm.
Juliet flame, right? That she had actually married his best friend growing up. Okay. And her name is Tara, and the best friend's name is Byron. Well, it isn't just that they got married. The more pivotal information that he finds out is the marriage has gone off the rails about a year ago. And the reason it went off the rails is because Tara and Byron's little boy was accidentally shot and killed by a hot-headed farmer. And ever since then, they have both fallen into grief. Tara's sort of like gone into guilt, grief, and she's turned to God for relief. And Byron, well, he has just hit the booze. He's a very angry person. He's an alcoholic, and he's sort of become a recluse back in a cabin in the woods. So the story is Penn reacquainting himself with his two old relations, and all three of them are in these very dire,
Mhm.
emotional, psychological moments in their lives. And over the next 3 days of deer hunting season, chaos ensues.
I think that that's such a
That's it.
smart play for the time period, like just
Yeah.
using when there's a lot of interesting stuff going on around the events, but then you also have such a tight time frame that's happening. It compresses things, so
Yeah.
it keeps the tension up when people can feel there's an actual clock on things.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
more interesting for the reader rather than as much as we love Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby. A lot of his other books kind of tend towards this sprawling period of time where I'm sorry, is he married? Is he not married? Are we getting a flashback? What's going on here? Just
All over
so
the place.
yeah,
Exactly.
I
Yes.
I like that you have a very specific defined time and place, and
Mhm.
that inherently makes the reader feel more invested in the story right from the
Yes.
get-go.
Yeah. And the genre, I guess people ask me a little bit about the genre. You could call it sort of a rural crime noir.
Hmm.
There's definitely crime in it.
Hmm.
There's some darker elements takes place in rural. And the actions these three characters take in the plot, very criminal, and it's sort of a dark story.
Hmm.
So it sort of dives into that.
Well, and I
So that's
think
it.
that your choice of setting it in the Ozarks gives it a very unique flavor in today's day and age.
Mhm.
As someone who lives in Los Angeles, you know that majority of stories, unless it's a major city,
Mhm.
most stories take place in LA, maybe Chicago or New York or one of the coasts.
Right. Absolutely.
People don't talk about Missouri. Missouri exists. That's the one like up near Oregon, right?
No.
I live in Iowa, and the amount of people I'm like, no, it's not Indiana. It's
Yeah.
not Idaho. It's right there in the middle.
Yeah.
It's an impressive choice to set a story in the flyover states. What was that decision like? Was that something that right from the get-go you're like, I wanted to set the story in this location just based on the history, or were there other reasons?
It's the history. So it goes back to your question, a little bit of a bio. Um, Again, I currently live in Los Angeles. I've lived in like Los Angeles area for about 25 years now. But I was born and raised in the Missouri Ozarks. I can trace my family roots back 5 generations that came
Wow.
in the 1820s.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So Missouri itself, it is in my blood. I cannot escape it.
Hmm.
And the story, when I started writing, I didn't start writing until I was probably in my mid 20s.
Hmm.
I would always, and I'd already left Missouri, but I kept coming back to things I grew up with, people I knew, definitely the setting, the descriptions, a lot of things I did in Missouri, the very rural setting. And it it is like my fantasy world. There's like
Hmm.
fantasy stories, right? So if somebody's writing a fantasy, they're trying to make up a world. So for me, Missouri is both realistic, but it's also a fantasy world in my imagination. So I just find myself writing a lot of stories from that area because I know it very well.
Hmm.
I just know it inherently.
You have the
Um,
mental map and
I have the
schema
mental
of it
map.
right
I have the
there.
language. I know what people do. I know what things look like. I grew up. In the country. The first 11 years of my life, I grew up in a town of less than 2,000 people, and it was in the hill countries, and I mean it was kind of in the back of the woods. So I know that area. So that's really where the nucleus of where I started this setting, because I just know it well. And I've written other stories, short stories that use the same setting. We've talked about Starlight, it's
Hmm.
Pulp Review, which we were both in, and number three. I have a short story in there that takes place in the same area.
Which I just need to call out. That is a fantastic short story. Everyone should buy the short story collection, if for no other reason than to read that one.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it was nice sharing the pages with you. But yeah, it's and that's sort of the thing I really like to write about, or that place, and just sort of the interesting characters that live there. They're both good and bad, but they're always funny. That's what I like about Missouri.
That should be the new state motto. Good, bad, always funny.
Always funny. Yes, yeah.
When did you first start writing Doe Run? What was that creative process
Okay,
like?
so this is a very unique uh, sort of circumstance. So when I went to I when I grew up, I didn't really have an outlet for my
Hmm.
imagination. I had a big imagination,
Hmm.
but I didn't draw, I didn't write, I didn't have anything to get out my imagination. So it came out while I was in college. I had moved to Florida when I went to
Hmm.
college at University of Central Florida. I was going to be an accountant of all
Hmm.
things.
You know, that very creative profession, being an accountant.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think everything just sort of like one day just sort of came down on me, and I was like, I don't want to be an accountant. So I walked across campus and I went to the theater building, and I'm like, what do I got to do to change my major? Because I figured with theater, it's like, well, I don't, maybe I can just get up and do something. Like I can't draw. I don't know what to do. So they said, well, why don't you take a couple of classes? So I say because uh, when I started taking my first acting classes is the first time I realized that I have a way to use my imagination expression. Now I came out in acting,
Hmm.
but I was okay at it. I was kind of a natural sort of guy who could get on stage and say a couple words and not look like a complete idiot. But what it turned into is sort of writing. I started writing short
Hmm.
little plays. And what I found out with writing is like, wow, this is even cooler because I can play every character. I
Hmm.
can create the world. I can make them say, I can make them do. And so that was the genesis of me becoming a writer. Okay.
Okay.
So now that I found my purpose in life, okay, great. Um, so at the time, I'm in my early to mid 20s. I had assumed that I was going to move to Hollywood and became a big movie actor, because that's
Yes.
just I know
That's
what
what
I'm
you do.
doing. That's just
Yes.
what you do. I mean, come on, what a great story. Some punk kid grows up in a small town, Missouri, goes to Hollywood, makes it famous. Um, so I found out real quick, acting doesn't really work out too well. but I always use my imagination, and I continued writing because I figured, well, writing I can still at least do at home. I can do it on my own.
Hmm.
I preface all of this because the answer to your question is Doe Run actually started out in the late 90s as a screenplay. It's that old.
Oh.
That story has been
Hmm.
around since the late 90s. And the book itself, the setting takes place in the 1990s.
Hmm.
Um, so that's where it started. And to segue a little, just jump forward
Yeah.
to end this story like where it started with. I was lucky enough when I moved to LA. I was lucky enough to land a film agent, and I was able to be hired to write a few screenplays. I made some good money at it. I got to live a little bit of the life, you might say. But none of that would have happened without Doe Run, because Doe
Hmm.
Run, the screenplay, was actually the first good thing I've ever written or
Oh.
had written,
Hmm.
and that was the script that was shown around Hollywood and helped me get an agent and sort of my springboard to do other things. And then boom, years go by. I'm done with Hollywood. I want to write. I'm writing. I write a novel. I'm like, well, let me try writing Go Run as a novel. Bingo, here we are. So this week it's a published novel.
That's really cool. It's
Yeah.
not awesome to see this, what was essentially an artifact to a certain degree,
Yep.
be able to be, I don't want to say repurposed because I don't think that's the appropriate way. It's like you were able to polish it into this gem. And that's
Yep.
awesome. That's so cool,
And
especially since I think that the 1990s setting has aged really well in the way that sometimes when something's like a period setting doesn't.
yes, I think so, especially with if you read novels from the time, but more importantly, if you watch crime movies from the
Hmm.
90s, those all those indie crime movies
Oh, Pulp
were
Fiction.
fabulous. It was like, it's almost looking back on it like, the early 70s movies,
Hmm.
looking back in history. And so that was sort of what I was trying to capture at the time, and I've just been able to capture, that in a bottle. And here we are in 2024, and it's, in a different form. But there you go. So yeah, the 90s, you know, you would have things like there was a movie called, it was also a book too called A Simple Plan with Bill Paxton and Billy Bob Thornton. Really,
I,
really good story. It's rural. It has to do with crime. It has to do
I'm
with
writing
these
this down.
guys. A Simple Plan. That's a really good one. And the other thing, it's not really crime, but you could kind of talk it with the different tropes that it used. Sling Blade with Billy Bob Thornton.
I've never
Oh,
seen
that's a
it.
really good. Oh, you need to see it. Yeah, yeah. But anyway, it's like I was only bringing those up because there was a
Yeah.
flavor in the '90s, a lot with films that
Hmm.
that was what I was trying to capture, at the time, and just sort of used it now. So,
Hmm.
um, so yeah, it's a unique story. I think I'm not probably the only person who's ever done this. I think the most famous one I've ever heard is, I believe, Cormac McCarthy. No
Mm.
Country for Old Men was
Yeah.
originally a screenplay, and then he
Hmm.
wrote it as a novel, and then the Coen brothers rewrote it as a screenplay. Made a great movie. Uh,
Well, but I'm sure that has made the so I was recently reading a book on scene work, and I think that that's
mhm.
something that is taught
Yeah,
better in plays and in screenplays than to
yeah,
novel writers
yeah,
because you're thinking more in terms of scenes and acts, and
yes.
you're trying to create very specific tension, dialogue, and characters that uh, especially a certain era of novel wasn't
Mhm.
as concerned with.
Correct. Yeah, it goes back to whenever I write anything, it goes back to what I was saying with acting. I'd
Hmm.
never done any sort of expression with acting until I think I was 21, 22 years old, and I was in a college. And what I learned from it is that it all comes down to me with characters. Like, what is the
Hmm.
character? What are they going through? You know, what are they saying? Why are they saying things? You know, when a playwright writes dialogue, you know, a playwright, there's an intention of why that character's saying these specific words, okay,
Hmm.
or moves across stage in a certain way, right? So it all comes from that. And you know, I have a very visual imagination, so that's where the screenplay and the movies came about. And what was, you know, it took me a long time to do is learn how to write prose.
Hmm.
You know, you can write a screenplay like you write action. You know, you can kind of play with words and play with language. But you know, it took me a long time. I like to play around with poetry. I like to play around with different forms. And when you're playing around with poetry, that kind of teaches you the magic of specific words, their
Hmm.
meanings, their sounds, their layout on the page, the sentencing. And so I just sort of adapted at my own. No one's really taught me. I read a lot, of course, and you're
Hmm.
influenced a lot. But it took me a long time, and so I ended up really enjoying writing in different forms. The screenplays, the plays, you know, the poetry. When it eventually came into prose, playing around with Doe Run, is at the same time as I was writing this book, I started playing around with a lot of different short stories. You know, like the one in Starlight. So, and you know, I found out to find a little bit of success.
Hmm.
Success in terms of like, yes, some of them are published, but more success was like, wow, I think that's a really interesting story in the way I told it. And so it all sort of came together with this book. And I'm very proud of it. You know, it does have some lyricism in its wording, but I've always felt, and anybody who ever read it as a screenplay has always felt it's a really interesting, unique story. And so that's what a good book should have. At the end of the day, is a good story.
You know what? At the end of it, so I read this last year for the first time in a long time. What was it called? The not the Man in the Iron Mask. Think of the other French face cover. Not Mask of Phantasm. That's Batman movie.
Zorro?
The
No.
no. Phantom of the Opera. I
Phantom of the
finally
Opera.
read
Yes.
Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah.
The story is boring, going in
Yeah.
so many different bad directions where you're just
Yeah.
like, why is it that going into this? But the concept there was so strong that it
Yeah.
is something that's been adapted multiple times.
Yeah.
It's having a good story with good characters is the first thing.
It's always the first.
That
Yes.
is the primary. And if you have good characters and a good story,
Hmm.
there's so many other things that can be maybe less than perfect. But the
Yeah.
reality is, if you have all of the things, that's what makes good reading. And I think
That's
that
what
it
makes
just
good reading. Yeah.
onto the lyricism comment, I remember reading once a book called like How to Write Like Shakespeare. And I
Mhm.
think the thing that was most fascinating is they actually went through these are the words picked, and then this is the order in which they're placed. That is what makes certain elements of Shakespeare more memorable than, say, his contemporaries.
Yes. Absolutely. It's the placement of words. You know,
Hmm.
it's like it's when it comes down to the actual word itself and the and that's where poetry kind of came in. It, you know,
Hmm.
in through my life, like I'm a teacher right now. So, you know, I studied poetry. I teach poetry. I've done that many years, and that's that. You know, what you've just said is important, especially with Shakespeare. Um, you know, just a simple aspect in poetry. There's one technique that's always my favorite technique in poetry. It's called enjambment, right? And enjambment is you write a line, right?
Uh-huh.
That's the thing with poetry. You write a line, and whatever the line says, it ends. And then the next line starts. And the last word of that first line, and then the next word or two words after it can completely change the meaning of what the
Hmm.
first line meant. And that's what's beautiful about poetry. You're like, oh, because as a reader, I love being tricked by writers,
Hmm.
whether with plot, you know, if it's a mystery, a lot of us we read a lot of mysteries. We can see things coming. But anytime you run across something like when you are completely fooled,
Hmm.
God, I love that. You know, and poetry can do that, with a really good poet if you just know how to play with enjambment. And that, and Shakespeare was a master of it, I think is what people believe about that guy.
I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about playing with different forms because
Mhm.
you have written a stellar novel, a stellar, and many stellar short stories.
Mhm.
What does the process, is there a difference when you're working on a short story versus a novel in terms of the composition for you? Or how do you approach one versus the other?
I'm sort of a, I'm sort of the type that I'll just try anything and I'll throw everything at, throw all the spitballs at the board or whatever works. And, I'm not a writer that sets out to, hey, I'm going to write a poem and I want it to do this.
Hmm.
Every once in a while, something will come to me, some thought, some concept, and I may be driving, I may be just hanging out in my backyard or whatever, and it just sort of starts coming in my head of just like playing with these words. And if it lasts longer than 5 minutes, I'll go grab a pen and paper and I'll just start playing, you know. And poems just sort of they just like, oh, let me play around with it. Things like, with screenplays. I haven't written a lot of screenplay probably been about 6 years since I've actually written my last screenplay. But what I did with screenplays, I would generally do research and a lot of outlining, okay,
Hmm.
because that was more like, it has
Yeah.
to do with story. I want to know
Hmm.
where the story is going, and then I can kind of structure it. But then when you structure a screenplay, it has its own structure. That's where it kind of becomes more like poetry. It's like, okay, I
Hmm.
know what I'm doing. I know what the characters are going to do. I know the setting. How long does the scene need to be? Maybe I make it a quick cut, and you get to play with it, poetry. Short stories and novels, I mean, they're similar. It's like sometimes I'll write an outline or I'll have an idea, and then I'll start writing it and it won't work and it won't work and I'll struggle with it. And then one day I'll just like take off on a new tangent, and then it'll write itself. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, the only thing with the novel, the only thing I can say, I kind of went through that. This is my first novel. It's my first novel I've ever written. And it took 25, 30 years to get to it. But it took me a long time to get it to a place where I was satisfied with it.
Hmm.
But it moves. I mean, the novel itself, it moves a little bit like the film,
Hmm.
a film version if it was ever made,
Hmm.
where it starts right out of the gate.
Cohen brothers, are you listening?
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Yeah, I mean, it just starts right out of the gate. You get to know these characters. There are secrets, like you you tend to don't want to give, the reader all the
Hmm.
information because I wanted to make the characters hold on to their own secrets. So it's sort of a
Hmm.
slow burn tension.
Hmm.
And I really like the outcome that came out with that. So, in moving forward, I'm playing around with a couple other novels right now. It'll probably take me 30 years to finish it, or maybe not. Maybe it'll take me 6 months. It just depends. But they're all different. I don't have any really one way to do anything. I don't have really a one style to do anything. I just like playing and seeing what I can do with what I can do with words and story.
Hmm.
And that's about it.
What does your writing routine look like if you have one?
It's the same thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there'll be weeks I won't write anything. There'll be weeks where you can't get me off, writing notes or on the laptop. It comes. It
Hmm.
just comes. I'm a terrible example of discipline. Uh, I am. I just, it's in but at the same time, even if I'm not physically writing out in some form, whether it be typing it or outlining it or just writing, certain scenes or whatever I'm doing, I'm still always, it goes back like it's my imagination that I've had it since I was a kid. It is always playing. Something's always playing
Hmm.
while I'm driving or whether I take a lot of walks. And sometimes to the detriment of my real life, my wife and kids are sometimes like, hey, will you like
You're spaced out.
wake up, yeah, like what do you, hey, I'm talking to you, or where, like, oh, what do you, it's like, I'm sorry, so I have to pull myself out. But that said, I'm trying to be a little bit more disciplined. I'd say
Mhm.
most of the writing I have done past couple of years mostly comes like right now in my summers,
Mhm.
because I do teach,
That's
and
a great way of like having a season that you
yeah,
can, like in sports, you have the writing season that you can spend
yes,
time focused on.
yeah. So I try to plan out my life
Hmm.
by seasons exactly. I do that with my drinking too, by the way. Just picking a season. So that was pretty funny. I always had this thing where I always like, it's summertime, right? It's like, well, I know it's summertime when I start drinking Mexican beer and tequila. I know it's like wintertime when I want to drink dark beer and red wine and
Hmm.
bourbon.
Hmm.
So writing's like it's like the same thing. I kind of go in the seasonal changes other than discipline planning. I have
Hmm.
my own way of doing things. So
Well,
that's it.
at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is the work done or not. The
And that's what it is. Can you get it out? And and I've been fortunate enough, looking, I'm starting to get more of a pretty big catalog. Like I still have
Mhm.
screenplays that are just okay, they're there, and maybe I'll do the same thing with them, one of them or two of them, what I did
Mhm.
with this one. It just kind of go like, okay, this maybe I'm just the guy that's reinventing, refurbishing old stories into a new form that nobody ever got to read. So with
Mhm.
screenplays, the only people that ever read them are people in the movie industry. And people in the movie industry, they don't read. So so I mean it's the way it works.
Well, Ian Fleming, back in the when he was shopping around, he was trying to make a James Bond TV show happen. This is before the
Oh,
movies, before anything. He
right.
wrote a whole bunch of like just short little premises and kind of pseudo teleplays
Yeah.
or different things that Bond could go on this adventure. Half of his short stories are all based on, oh, Bond could do this basic outline, and then he's like, well, no one's picking this up. Coming up with
Yeah.
something new is so hard, and he just grabbed it, and
They
then
just
we
use
have
it.
Octopussy.
Yes, exactly. And and I think that's it's a good way for a writer, especially if
Hmm.
you're going to stick with it for a number of years, because once you get older, like I have the gray hair. I've been around a little bit.
You've
It's
got
like
the
you can
silver
actually,
fox going on right now,
yeah,
looking
I
absolutely
definitely
on
do.
point.
It's gonna go. It's gonna go Anderson Cooper pretty soon, I think. But it's gonna be all white. But yeah, it's like I've reached a point in my life. It's like, wow, I have planted a lot of seeds in the
Hmm.
field behind me. It's like,
Hmm.
oh wow, it's like, that's a little sapling I can actually plant in this new fertile field and let it kind of go. So I think it's a really good way. Some writers, if you notice, um, if Fleming did this a little bit with Bond, it's like they'll get on a roll
Hmm.
of like a series, right?
Yep.
It's like they'll write a book and it has a setting and it has these characters and it has these themes and ideas and plots. And then they'll write another book. And even though the other book is different, it's still like the same setting. It's still
Yep.
very, and then the third one, and there's nothing wrong with that, but
Hmm.
it's the idea of like, well, let me just reuse
Hmm.
what I already have established and just sort of like
Hmm.
nuance it to make it a little bit different. And a lot of readers love that. A lot of a
Yeah.
lot of readers of authors love that. Um,
Um,
I'm not really that sort of guy.
yeah.
I'll write different settings, but I really want
Hmm.
different plots going on.
Well, I think that that's an interesting thing. Like you've described, essentially the Ozarks are kind of like your Middle Earth
Yeah.
in a certain way.
Hmm.
What you have as an interesting thing in this is, especially depending on like how much you write in this particular setting,
Hmm.
is the cohesive thing to it is you have the world to play in.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah. It's the sandbox. Yeah.
yeah, the sandbox that you make is it's fascinating because it is a real place,
Hmm.
which I think what was the book I was reading? Matt Bird. Oh, look, my thumbs up thing came up. The
No,
For those
I
who are
like
just listening to the podcast instead of watching on YouTube, a new function on the computer is that it will like capture if my thumb goes up and then create a thumbs up on screen. So you can't see that if you're
Wow.
listening to us, but if you're subscribed on
Technology.
YouTube,
Wow.
you can see it. Back to my main point. I think it was The Secrets of Character by Matt Bird. He was talking about how essentially when someone buys a book, they know you're about to lie to them for however many pages the book is. So
Mhm.
your entire goal is to make it as real as possible and believable as possible right at the start. And I think that you do a fantastic job in Doe Run with that, making right from the get-go, these feel like real people that you're meeting in the story.
Yeah.
And having to deal with situations, all the major plot beats that have to happen in the first 10 pages to make you, Bird breaks it down as believe, care, and invest. You
Mhm.
do perfectly because you're immediately invested in this is who the character is. You know that he can deal with a certain degree of stuff happening, and you understand what he's about to do, or at least you have an idea of what he
You have
wants.
an idea, right? Yeah, yeah. It's that's an important. I think that's important not only as a writer for me, but the books I like.
Hmm.
They do that. I read a lot of crime novels, but I read a lot of novels. We were talking about Frankenstein. The thing about Frankenstein that is probably the most difficult thing about Frankenstein the novel is the beginning, because the beginning of that novel has nothing to do with Victor Frankenstein or this monster. It's like it's 4 letters written by some sea captain. you know um Now, that is the opposite of the thing you're talking about. But with some authors and some books, it does take a little time
Hmm.
kind of to get into it. I prefer, when I write, is to let's get to it. You know, even if I'm holding back on sort of the main conflicts that are going to happen for
Hmm.
a character, at least you're giving little Easter eggs, you're giving little clues that you may not know it as a reader. But once you get through it, you'll either read it again or it'll come back to you. It's like, oh, I see. Oh. Because I love books that do that. I love books that do that.
Have you
Yeah.
read Alistair MacLean at all?
No.
He wrote a whole bunch of like men's adventure fiction in like
Hmm.
post World War II era. So
Hmm.
like he wrote The Guns of Navarone was a book that then
Okay.
became the film
Know the
Where
movie.
Eagles
Okay. Yeah.
Dare. Like he was like that guy who had an
Yeah.
amazing run of like you've described. It's basically hard-bitten ensemble cast of manly men do the thing is
Yeah.
what most of his books are. But
Yeah.
in one of them, I read that was fantastic, but interesting and weird was Ice Station Zebra. And in that
Hmm.
book, like it starts out with the professor doctor character talking his way onto a ship. And he's like, I felt really bad for lying to them when he's like given his whole spiel. And
Yeah.
like that was a very unsubtle way of what you've just described, which is I'm going to hold back information from the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then like, okay, I lied. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it has to go with that fooling with poetry, how
Hmm.
things change. When I look at a story, and a lot of story is character developed, I'm usually looking at the character.
Hmm.
What a character is doing, their actions, what they say. The more they can lead me away
Uh-huh.
and then twist it a different way, I love it. I just always love it. I like some of the other stories I've written, and an idea of why I like writing characters, like I mentioned earlier about Missouri's a little bit. It's it's good, there's good and there's bad, but it's always funny. I like I'm always fascinated by stories and writing stories about characters that do on the surface are just heinous things like incestual relationships or murder or just like because think it was like if you read the newspaper you know of what somebody did and you're like, oh my god, how could they have done that? But then if you tell a story
Hmm.
about that character and their circumstances and their motivations, maybe and at the end of the story you're going, okay, it's still heinous, but I understand why they did it.
I mean, Game of
I
Thrones.
am so yes, I am so fascinated by those stories, and that's a lot of my short stories. I try to
Hmm.
tap into that where it's like if you're being judgmental on a person,
Hmm.
you're more moral than what somebody did. But then when you read why they did it, you can kind of put that character on a same moral plane that you are, even though they did something very, you know, risque, I guess you might say. But yeah, Game of Thrones. Oh, I love Game of Thrones. Yeah.
But
Uh,
like yeah, it's bad characters that
yeah.
do terrible things, yet if you eventually get to the point where like, really, are they so bad? Like I totally poor Jamie losing his arm, hand, all
Oh
this
my
stuff.
God. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I blame his sister, but that's okay. I guess he just had a thing for her. I don't know.
So you've talked a lot about books you're reading. First
Mhm.
question I have
Mhm.
is there something that when you read it instantly breaks a character from reality for you? So like you're reading the book, you're invested in the character, and then this something switches where you're like, this doesn't feel like now they feel written instead of real. That'd be my first question. My second one is, what is on your reading list this summer? And is it anything you've
Um,
assigned students?
well, the first question, I got to think about it a little bit. So you're talking about a character that breaks character.
Yes. What breaks character for you in a story?
Um, if the character, yeah, it's like with me, if I'm writing or if I'm reading something, if it's just usually it's dialogue,
Mm,
if says something that the character wouldn't say that way,
hmm.
or and it could be an action sometimes, but it's rare. Your second question though, I can get to that pretty quick. So currently, I'm reading, finishing up Heat 2 for the second
Ooh.
time. Yeah, it's a bulk of a book. It kind of
Hmm.
goes against what I was saying. Like I like books that bust out of the gate and get through. I like short books. I like
Hmm.
short.
Same.
Heat,
He's a
it's
3 hour
bulky.
movie. Like the
Yeah,
movie
it's
itself is
the
huge.
movie itself, and in the book, it's split up as a prequel and sequel, so you're following two plot lines, but you're also in your head, you're putting it together how it places with the movie Heat. But it's a good book. I'm reading it for style.
Hmm.
I'm working on something a little bit now that's more about high action crime
Ooh.
in LA time period around the year 2000, which this kind of
Ooh.
hits on. So I'm looking more like style.
Uh-huh.
Um, I just finished a new book by a Southern Georgian writer named Brian Panowitz. He's got a new book out called Nothing But the Bones.
Ooh.
Just finished that. You know what? Let's see if I have it. I just finished. Grab this real quick. This is a great book. There's a guy that lives. He's from L.A. I met him recently. His kids had actually went to Burbank High School. It was before I went to work there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So, uh, but he has a new book called The California Bear, which is a good book.
Hmm.
But I went back and read some of his earlier stuff. This is called The Wheelman. His name is
Ooh, what a great
Ryan
cover.
Kaminski. Yeah, it's a great cover. You know, and it's just like I said, it
It's
starts and it just blazes. Really good book.
called The
Um,
Wheelman.
it's called The Wheelman. Yeah.
Great title.
Um, I finished James Elroy's The Enchanters, which again is a bulk of a book. And oh my God, it's just Elroy. I don't know, Elroy, it's his own thing, but it was good. Um, what else? I've read a few other things, but yeah, I read a lot. I do read a lot. And the things I teach, um, I have sort of my go-tos, like Frankenstein's a go-to. I teach right now. I'm teaching AP Lang, which is mostly nonfiction, but I always make sure to throw some fiction into my students because it's like you need to
Hmm.
know these stories. Um, but I teach The Road by McCarthy. That's
Oh
sort of my
yeah.
go-to. Yeah, that's a go-to for me. I love that book. Anything with McCarthy, I'll always read one of McCarthy's books, reread it every year. Because I just again talk about characters, um, child of God,
Mhm.
this heathen wandering around the Tennessee hills, finding dead bodies to have sex with. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so yeah, that's right up my alley. That's what it is. And Tennessee's a little bit like Missouri. So there you
Yeah.
go. Yeah.
What do you have coming down the pike now? So you said that you're working on cooking a few things.
So
What can we
I got
expect
a
next?
I got a couple things that I am working on. There's a story that it came to my mind about 5 years ago, and I've tinkered with it. I'm at a point now I'm really starting to kind of roll with it. Let's just call it a a rendition of Oedipus Rex takes
Ooh,
place at the turn of the 20th century in the Ozarks. So it's
okay.
1900s in the
Yes.
Ozarks. And if you think 1900 Ozarks, you know, incest, come on. It's right there.
It
It's
is
right
right
there.
there.
So, but I have the story in my head, and it's a fairly big story. It's multi-character, multiple perspectives, and so I'm playing with that. I'm also playing around a little bit with. So what I was talking about, what I did with Doe Run, I wrote sort of the first script that I wrote. Doe Run was the first script that I wrote that people paid attention to. The first script that I actually got money for was was about high speed car chases in LA
Ooh.
around the year 2000. And and that was very in vogue. I mean, every day. I just moved to LA, a few years before. It's like every day in the news there'd be a high speed car chase. That was like the news thing, right? Wasn't so much politics back then. There was a little bit of politics, but take
Oh, the
politics
blissful
out of the news.
2000s.
In LA, it was every day. It was like, okay, what's the high speed car chase? It's like, so it was always a fascinating concept. I always hoped it would get made. It never did. But I'm sort of re kind of going back to that. So, the thing about also about writing for me, whether it be 1900s Missouri or 1993 Missouri or 2000 LA, I have a really, really difficult time of being able to, in my head, write about today's times just because of technology, because
Hmm.
everybody spends so much time on their phones
Yeah.
and everything. And it's like when you're talking about characters and situation and doing things,
Hmm.
whether it be crime, whether it be ever, it's like, it's just not exciting. It's just not
Yeah.
that exciting, for me to kind of go into. So I tend to write more historical.
Hmm.
2000s at this point is almost history, So
Yeah.
yeah, the Y2K is kind of a historical event that didn't happen, but yeah. So I'm tinkering with those two ideas. And they're coming fairly quick. If
Hmm.
I had a goal in mind, would try to have one of these done within the next year, and
Hmm.
kind of follow that up with Doe Run to see if anybody Anybody want to read another book by me? You know, we'll see. See. So, uh,
Sean, it's always a pleasure. Where can people go
yes,
to
man.
learn more about you and your work?
So the easiest way is go to Sean Sean Jaques Jacques author.com. And yeah, my website, it's got everything, a lot of stuff I've written. It's got a lot about the book. It's got it will have this cast up pretty soon when it's available. Anything that's going on with me right now, that's where you can find it.
And we'll link that in the show notes too, along with the book.
Awesome. That would be great. So I guess this is it. Thank you for having me. This is great.
Absolutely. It's been a blast.
Yeah. So maybe I'll get to see you again one of these days in Starlight or something else. Maybe we can share pages again.
It'll be a pleasure.